Yes, hello everybody. Welcome to my talk about if you should use Hibernate or not. I think I can answer the questions. It depends. So you can go have a coffee. Or you can stay here and watch my talk, because I will talk about the persistence framework that is called jOOQ, jOOQ. And first and foremost about me, I'm already working in the software industry for close to 30 years now. I started on mainframe computers in 1995, and I was first learning SQL before programming, more or less. That's not entirely true, because I was already programming when I was a kid. But professionally, I started with SQL, then I learned COBOL and so on, and in the year 2000, I switched to Java. I'm teaching at 2 universities in Switzerland, and the last 2 years, maybe, I start talking at conferences. I was talking at conferences before, mainly in Switzerland or in Germany, but now I also do that like in Belgium or in other countries. What I like to talk to you about is track and field. Why track and field? I'm in a sports club in Switzerland since I'm a little boy, and we organizing events for kids. So we have 3 events per year where they can come and they do long jump and run and stuff like that. And it was around the year 1997 when I realized that this should be done with some computer software. Because before we had some lists where we could read the result. For example, if someone jumps 3 meters in long jump, then we had a table to find the points. And I thought, yeah, that's maybe not how it should be. And I started to create an application that's called JTrack and Field. The one that I will show you is not so old. I recently switched from some different UI framework to Vadin. But it also uses jOOQ, and that's why I will show you some parts of that. The application, maybe, let's have a look how this looks like. So that's the UI. By the way, this is a multi-tenant application. You could use it. It's open source, available on GitHub. If you also are in a track and field or in a sports club and doing some sort of competition, maybe you can use that. And the goal of this application is finally to get a ranking list. So if we have a look at this ranking list here, then we see a typical list. We have some categories here. We have participants. The participant has some events like 80 meters, long jump. It's all written in German because I'm speaking German in Switzerland. And we also have the results, and the number here in the brackets, that's the calculated points. Now, why I'm talking about this ranking list, the interesting thing about that's a tree. Right. And I can say that I just use one SQL query to create the entire ranking list. And I will show you today how this works, because the rest of the application, if you have a look at it, where you can manage the data, so for example, you can manage the athletes, is a typical business application. Who of you is creating applications that look similar to that? A lot of people. So classically, some back-end applications or ERP system where you can manage products, customers, and stuff like that looks similar. So you usually have tables, and for example, here, if I click on this element in the table, then now I have a dialog, and I can edit the data, and it will be stored back to the database. So that's the use case that I have. I also have a database model for that. This is still the same, more or less, since I started with creating this application. The thing that changed during the development is the organization on top, because in the beginning it was not multi-tenant capable, and I added this functionality later on because I also have other sports clubs using this application. But from the model you can see that we have something called a series. Why do we have a series? A series can contain multiple competitions. So if you maybe look track and field or watch track and field on television, like Golden League or Diamond League, then you see that this is a very common situation where you have a final ranking list for for the whole series. Then we have some categories. The categories have athletes, and an athlete may have a club, depending on what type of competition we are running. And the event finally there is like 80 meters or long jump or any other thing that they can do. And finally, you will get the result. And I will show you some examples based on this model. Now the question was initially, do you really need Hibernate? So how could we create such an application? Usually there is a default choice if it comes to Java Persistent, and that's called Java Persistence API. The point is, it's not really important which one you use if you use it correctly, or if you use it for the right purpose. Because the difference between JPA and jOOQ stands just for SQL, I would say, is it's depending on the approach that you want to have when you work with your persistent model. So if you have a JPA entity model, then you have something like entity state transition. What does that mean? So imagine the athlete that I've shown you before in the application. Someone fetches it from the database, and then it calls some business methods. And during the business method, the state of the entity will be changed. And finally, you can tell Hibernate, store it. And Hibernate will think, yeah, maybe I should do an update or an insert or a delete. You can define cascading on the relationships, and this will happen behind the scenes for you. And that's what I mean with entity state transition. The other approach I call dataset transformation. What does that mean? If we have a look at the application again, we see that we have here data sets or records. So if you click on that and I change something, I don't do that because that's my local system, it's fine. So this is production. Like I change the name, then it will be stored right. So and the sole purpose for this UI here is to change the state in the database. So there's no business logic involved. The only business logic involved in my application indeed is if I start to enter results. So for example, if I search for some kid here, so I can start to enter some data, and as you can see here on the right side, it will calculate the points. That's my business logic. Other than that, it's just reading data, storing data. And if you have an application that has more, or is more this kind of application, it's also known as CRUD, so create, read, update, and delete, then you are better off maybe with the model that allows data state transformation instead of entity state transition. But, and that's very important, neither one is the best. It really depends on the use case and on your preferences. But today I'd like to show you how you can do this dataset transformation with a framework, and the framework is called jOOQ or jOOQ. And this picture is from the website, and it says that jOOQ generates Java code for you, so there must be some mechanism to generate Java code. And then you have Fluent API, that means you have a domain-specific language to create SQL statements. So that's more or less everything that jOOQ does. And I will show you how this works and how you can use it. So I created an example project for you. It's on GitHub. CMAS.ch is my GitHub username, and there is an example. It's called jOOQ examples. Or you can go to the jOOQ documentation, or there is also a jOOQ demo application. So now, how is that different from when you use something like an OR mapping? The difference is jOOQ is database first. So the most important thing beside jOOQ and Java is the database. So that means that you usually have a database model that exists, or you start modeling the database model. So that's not really different. I mean, even with domain-driven design, you can say we have an entity model, or we have a domain model with entities, and the entities are database tables, right? So it's no difference. You also have relationships between the database tables, so there is no problem starting with the database first. The important thing is jOOQ does not tell you how you should create your database. So it really doesn't matter. So you don't have a mapping or something. jOOQ takes your database and then it uses as it is. And so we can have a look how this works. jOOQ has two parts. So the first part that we need is the lower one. So we use the jOOQ generator to create Java classes. And the Java classes are generated based on a database. Now the question is, where does this database come from? The database could be a real database. For example, you have something like a reference database. I have a customer, for example, that has a huge database model, and they have a called reference database model that they also use some migration scripts and stuff, but we generate the data from there. Or the database could run in a test container, for example, and you can use that one to generate the code. Or you could even use migration scripts. So maybe who is using Flyway or Liquibase for database migrations? A lot of people. So you can use just the SQL statements or whatever scripts that you're using there to create your database tables to generate the code for jOOQ. The problem with that approach based on the scripts is you cannot use all functionality that the database provides. So this is a bit limited. So it's in the real world, in my opinion, it's better to use a real database, and I will show you how you can do that together with Testcontainers. Now, I already had this talk once or twice, and I had a question. And the question was, does jOOQ scale? Because you know, the examples that I show you are very small. We have a handful of database tables, even in my track and field application. But the point is, jOOQ was created because it has to work with huge databases. So the creator of jOOQ is Lukas Eder. He's also from Switzerland. And he created jOOQ for a Swiss bank. And they had thousands of database tables. And he needed some way to access that from Java. And from my side, the biggest application that I working on where we use jOOQ is an ERP product. And we have around 2,000 tables and views. And that's a bit special there. We have 5,000 store procedures. So the whole business logic is in Oracle database and store procedures. Why that? Because they were using Oracle Forms before. And I tell you a secret, the database model there is more or less 35 years old. So that means, and a lot of people are not aware of that, but in my opinion or in my experience, database models stay longer than applications. So for this ERP system, we are currently creating the version 5. So it's the 5th generation of the same ERP system with another UI, but with still the same database model. And that's also why they decided to keep the business logic in the database, because they assume that they will have version 6 in maybe 5 years, right? So if you have such applications where the database model is really key, then probably jOOQ is a very good solution for you. So that's everything from the introduction. Let's have a look at some code. So first we go to a kind of a demo project that's called jOOQ examples. And to understand the generator, we have to have a look at the POM file. By the way, who of you is using Maven? And who is using Gradle? A few, huh? The point is that the official plugin for jOOQ is a Maven plugin. There is a Gradle plugin from Etienne Studer. He's even from the Gradle team. And I think there is a feature request to move that plugin from Gradle to jOOQ, because if there are new versions of jOOQ, sometimes the Gradle plugin is a bit behind, or maybe behind. But I will show you Maven plugin, because I'm also more of a Maven user. The project here uses Spring Boot, and Spring Boot also has a starter for jOOQ. You could also use Quarkus. By the way, who is using Quarkus here? Some. So the point is, jOOQ is not related to any framework, right? So you can use jOOQ with public static void main, or with a main method. Now with an anonymous class, it doesn't matter. But usually if you use it with the framework, you can configure the framework, or the configure in case of Spring Boot will be auto-configured, that it uses the default data source, for example, or that it uses the transaction management, right? So you have some benefits from that. For Quarkus, there is also a Quarkus extension that does the same. Now I'm using Flyway here. I use H2. I'm no longer using H2 normally for testing purposes, since we have Testcontainers, which is a much better solution because you can test against the real database, and especially if you're into SQL development and use some features of the database that may not be there in H2, for example. So it's probably better to use a real database. And then we have this jOOQ CodeGen Maven plugin. I will show you in my pet project a different way to do that. And here you have a configuration for the generation. And in that case, we are using this so-called DDL database. That means jOOQ will read the SQL statements and use that as a base to generate code. Here we have a special property because Flyway uses the sort based on the V and the number behind, and then I can define a target package. And now I can run that. So, for example, if I do a Maven compile, oops, it's a bit small. Where's Maven? Here we are. Then you can see that jOOQ here starts the plugin, or the plugin started. And where does it start? Here we are. And now jOOQ will, first of all, print out what is configured. You can generate a lot of things. So we will see what it generates now in this project. But you could also generate like a data access object layer directly from jOOQ, or you can have a POJO model that you can use to fetch the data. What's important here that we see that it found 14 tables, and it generated code for these 14 tables. And the code that jOOQ generates is kind of a meta model for the database. That means if we go to the generated sources in the target directory, that's the default directory for generating. So even IntelliJ will find the generated classes automatically and will add it to the class path. And here we have some information about the database itself. So we have like a default schema catalog. We have some tables, keys, and sequences. But what's interesting is we have records. So that means now here, tables, sorry, not records. That means every class here in the tables package is a representation of the table that I have in the database. So if we have a look at the athlete, we will see that we find here a class that extends some table impl from jOOQ, and then we have constants. So we have constants for the table itself, and we have constants for all database columns. And the purpose of this code is that you can use it as a type-safe way to write SQL together with the jOOQ DSL. The interesting thing about that is that it also extracts some other information from the database. For example, it extracts the database column type. It extracts if it's nullable or not. It extracts if it's, for example, a primary key. Or here we can see that the default value is taken from a sequence called athlete-seq. And if we had some comments, we would also see the comments here. So if you start with a database model, and that's what my ERP customer is doing, they document the database. So they add comments to tables, they add comments to columns. And this is also generated here. So you as a Java developer could have a look what the database creator has added as sequences. The second thing that is generated is a record. So if your database table has a primary key, jOOQ will generate something that extends updatable record. And this record is kind of a active record pattern implementation. That means we have here methods like save, for example, not save, store, for example, or delete, or something like that. So you can read the record, change it, and call store, and jOOQ will execute it. And store will also do either a insert or an update statement, depending on if it's a new record or not. So that's how the generator works. There are two questions now with the generated code. First, do we put that in version control? And the second is, how long does it take? I usually don't put it in version control because it can be regenerated every time, and the idea is also to regenerate it when the database changes, because if the database changes, for example, the athlete table no longer has a, what columns do we have here? No longer has a first name, for example. Then the first name will be missing here in this athlete class, and my code will not compile. So that's the difference if you're having type-safe SQL. In contrast, if you're using Spring JDBC, for example, where you have strings as JDBC, this will fail on runtime. This one will fail on compile time already. So I usually don't put it in version control. The other question is, when do we run that? So in my examples, I run it when I do a build of the application, because this takes seconds to run. But imagine you have, like my ERP customer, they have around 8,000 database objects. And this will create 8,000 Java classes, plus some other classes. And then finally, this takes like 6 minutes to build. So not the generation from jOOQ takes 6 minutes, but the compile for these 8,000 classes takes very long. So in that case, we separate the generation of jOOQ inside a known pipeline, and we update the project version of that dependency during that pipeline build. That's how we do that with big projects, but it really depends how many tables you finally have in your application. Now, let's have a look at some tests that we can see how we can use that. And what we see here is a Spring Boot test. And if you know Spring Boot has test slices. The test slice mean it starts only the parts of Spring Boot context that is really necessary to run the tests. And here, like you have data JPA test, there is also a jOOQ test slide that just starts the database layer, more or less, plus it configures the so-called DSL context. And DSL context is like the entity manager or the session with Hibernate or JPA. It's the class that you use to build and execute SQL statements. And this one gets auto-configured with Spring Boot, so that's why I can inject it here directly inside my test. And querying the database looks like that. So this means that you have really kind of embedded SQL in form of this jOOQ DSL into your code. And here you also can see that we use the constants that were generated. So this is type safe. If someone goes ahead and renames the competition table into some other name, then the code here also will fail. This one here is a shortcut. So select from is the same as select star from athlete. And then finally we have a method called fetch. That's like get result list with the entity manager. It returns a result. The result is a jOOQ class, by the way. This one implements list. So because the results of a database query is always sorted. If you don't define an order by clause, then it will have the order, how it is stored in the database, or how the database thinks that the order could be correct. And you get back the result. There are other ways to fetch data. You could also have a lazy fetching that will use a database cursor. So if you're doing batch processing, for example, and have a huge database table with millions of records, you better go ahead and use a cursor instead of fetching all data. You could also use things like limit and offset, for example. like so. And here is something that I didn't mention. jOOQ makes your code database agnostic. So like with Hibernate, you don't have to care what database is underneath, right? So you don't know if this limit and offset is done with limit and offset really, or limit and offset is done with top something. It depends on the database. So depending on the database you are using, this query might look differently, but this will also help you to migrate your application from one database to another. Who of you has already done that? Changed the database underneath your application? Some, yeah. I did that quite often recently because a lot of people are moving away from Oracle database to Postgres. And there, jOOQ is very helpful. Not only for that, but jOOQ also has on the website a converter. You can convert SQL statements from one database dialect to another. That's done with this mechanism behind the scenes that they use for creating the SQL statement. So that's how it works. If I fetch from a table, then I get these competition records here, or these active records back as a result. I could even do also projection, then I get something else, or I could use, like, for example, Java records as a result. That would also work. But I will show you that with the ranking list. Then you also have the possibility to define conditions, for sure. And here is something very important, because this looks like a dynamic query, right? And what's the problem of a dynamic query usually? It's SQL injection. So if I do that with the string, for example, and concatenate the string with the parameters, then I probably would have a SQL injection problem. jOOQ always uses prepared statements. So, and I can show you that because if you're using jOOQ, you can enable a logger that's called org-jOOQ and set it to debug, and then jOOQ will log some information about what he's doing. So let's have a look what it prints out. And we will see here the query. So that's a query that jOOQ executes. Here we see that jOOQ is using double quotes around the database objects. That depends if you like it or not, and it also depends if your database is case sensitive or not. Usually, if you don't do anything, so no quoting, then the database is case insensitive. Expect for MySQL and MariaDB, because the case sensitivity is based on the operating system you're using. So if you use Windows, there's case insensitive. If you're using it on Linux or on Mac, then it will be case sensitive, for example. And these are things that you can configure, how jOOQ should do that. You can configure that it should use lowercase names, or if it should quote, or whatever. There are various ways to configure things. But interestingly here is that we get the query twice. The reason for that is because it uses prepared statement. Then we will have this placeholder here, and that's quite annoying, right? So if you look at the SQL statements and you see this question marks for Hibernate, you can enable the basic binder logging, but this will log a lot of things, and it's not very handy if you have a big SQL statement with a lot of parameters. jOOQ can inline parameters, and that's what it's doing here, just for debugging purposes, that you see what's happening. And the other thing that's quite handy is jOOQ will print out the sample of the data, so it will not print all records, just probably maximum 5 records usually. And so you have an idea if the query that you wrote before matches your expectation. And that's quite helpful if you do that. So that's for this one. Now the question is, how do we store data? Storing data can be done with regular insert statements. So this is also straightforward if you know SQL. Here we have an insert tool. I define the columns, and then I set the values. And usually if you do an insert, you need the primary key, right? So if you're using JPA, the entity manager and the persist method, the contract is after calling persist, you get the primary key in the entity, right? Even if you don't commit the transaction, but it needs to fetch somehow the primary key. Usually with Hibernate, you would use a generated value with a generating strategy, maybe sequence, for example, here with H2 or with Postgres. jOOQ doesn't do anything here. So if you want to use sequences, you could do that by hand, or you could get the sequence and get the next value. What I did, I used the sequence as default value for my primary keys in the database schema. And for that purpose, I can use returning result. So that will create some insert into returning, depending on the database. You know, that's not with every database the same. And then I get back, for example, here, my assigned primary key. So that's something that I could do, but that's not so handy, right? So I have to write this insert statement. And that's where I personally find these active records are quite a good solution for that. Here we see that I used the DSL context to create a new record. Anybody an idea why I do that? Because I could just create an instance of athlete record. Any idea why I do that like this? The point is, jOOQ has to know how the record is assigned to a database connection or a transaction. So it's the same as you have a bit with the persistence context of Hibernate. There you also have different states of your entities, like managed or detached. And here you have to have your record attached to the current context in that environment. And that's why I use DSL new record, and then it's attached, and that means I can here call store, and the store knows which transaction runs and inserts the data in the database. And that's very handy because it's very helpful to have a record to do that. If in very simple applications, and this is also my application is very simple, so I use directly the records that are generated to bind to the UI for storing. I don't have another model. Then we for sure can also use projection. Here, for example, I created athlete DTO, that's a Java record. It has a first name, a last name, and a club name. And with the fetch-into method, I can tell jOOQ to populate the result inside athlete DTOs. That's a bit comparable to the constructor expression in Hibernate. The point here, how does jOOQ work? jOOQ tries to find a way to instantiate and populate the object. In that case, it will take the default constructor because there's no other way to create a record. There is also a possibility to pass a mapper to this fetch method, and you can map yourself something. So mappers sometimes are used if you, for example, have a legacy database where you have a Boolean value stored in a character field with yes or no, and you want to have an object that has a Boolean, then you could use a mapper for that. So it's very easy to create that. And here is something that you can even avoid. I have to join the club with the athlete to get the club name. And because jOOQ knows that there's a foreign key to this table and that's a to-one relationship, it can even do an implicit join. So jOOQ generates kind of a method on the athlete table that allows you to navigate over to-one relationships to other tables, and this will create an implicit join when you run the query. So that's very common or very similar to JPQL with the implicit join on one-to-one relationships. And finally, we also can delete a record or multiple records, and here we will get back the number of results. So that's fine, I would say. That's very interesting, but what about our ranking list? So because there we have a tree, right? And they need a tree structure. The problem is the result of a database query is always a table. There is no nesting. The SQL standard optimization team is discussing about something called multiset or nested results. If they can add it to the standard of SQL that databases can return such structures. But jOOQ has a solution for you. And if you look at the service where I create the ranking list, that is that one, then we see a bit of a complex SQL statement. It starts here on top. And the result here of this method, let's have a look at that. That's nested records. So on the top level, we have a competition ranking data record that takes name, date, and so on, and a list of categories. And then we have a category record with information with a list of athletes. Then we have an athlete record with information and a list of results. And finally, this is the result where we have the result plus the points that I need to display on the ranking list. And now the cool thing is I can read this data in one single query. And let's get back to that. Here, the start is straightforward. So we select the fields that we want to use from the computation table. And then we have this multiset operator or function that also takes a select statement with the information of the category. Then we have the multiset that selects the category athlete, and here we use the implicit join to come from this relationship table to the athlete table. Then we use this information again, an implicit join to the name, and finally we have the result with a multiset function. And now we have to do something because we have to tell jOOQ how it should map that. And therefore, we have this convert from method on the multiset function that we can, there we get the records and we can map the record, for example, here directly with a method reference to the constructor of the record. And we do that for every level. And finally, we can fetch one into a combination data record. Now, that's nice, but what happens now? And to show you that, I have to see where this runs here. Then we go to the competition ranking, clean that, and now let's create the ranking list. And here we really see just one SQL statement, and that's everything that comes out here. We also don't have redundancy in the database data that we get back. But jOOQ uses kind of a trick, because most databases today know how to produce JSON as a result. You could also use XML for the same, because XML fetching and storing in the database is already available since the late 90s in most of the databases. And recently, more or less every database has JSON functionality. Before they started with JSON functions to create JSON, but currently or today you can even store JSON inside the database tables, and you can even use JSON paths to access or to create queries to fetch JSON from the database. And here it uses this JSON functionality. So if we have a look at the fetched result, we see that the first 4 columns look quite normal, and then it starts with the multiset. And here inside we have something that looks like JSON or key value or whatever. And this is here. Not everything is visible. But if we have a look at the query, we see that it uses JSON-B aggregate, JSON build array, and so on. So it uses JSON functionality to have this query inside just one. By the way, Spring Data JDBC is working on something similar, that you are able to fetch also nested elements with Spring JDBC. And that's really a superpower in my opinion, because this prevents you from everything. So you will never have n+1 select problem, you will never fetch too much data. You just fetch that what you really need for your purpose. Exactly. And finally, to finish with the demo, I want to show you how I do the generation here in that project, because in that project I use Testcontainers. That's also a Spring Boot project. It uses Vaadin as a UI framework, and it uses Testcontainers. So the process here is, if I build the application, it starts as a test container with the Postgres database inside, and then it applies the Flyway script, and it generates the code based on the current state of this test container database. And because this is a very common use case for test containers in combination with jOOQ, the test containers team created a plugin for that. So we have a Maven plugin, and this can be found here. It's called Testcontainers jOOQ CodeGen Maven plugin, and it exactly does that. So you just have to define that. You have to define which database version or database you're using, in that case Postgres. You can define the type, you can define the image that it should use. You can have username, password, and database name if you need that to generate the data. And then you can define where the migration scripts come from. This is the default, so I could omit the whole Flyway section because that's default. You can also use Lickybase. If you have Lickybase, it works with both. And finally, we have the jOOQ generation here in the jOOQ section. That is the same as I've done in the normal jOOQ plugin in the other project. And so if we run that, maybe I can show you that this really works. It's already finished. By the way, the reason why I'm using Postgres is that it's incredibly fast started. I also work in projects where we use SQL Server database and in projects where we use Oracle databases. And starting, for example, a SQL Server database in a container takes around a minute, I would say. And starting an Oracle database in a test container, 3 minutes, maybe 3.5. Depends on if you're using a slim image or a full enterprise Oracle image. But here it really starts Postgres. So we can see that. Here is the plugin. And it uses Docker here. I could also use Testcontainers Cloud for sure for the same purpose. And then it starts this jOOQ test container that is managing the test container. That is starting then. So here we have the Postgres 5.2, and it starts in 0.82 seconds. So it starts in less than a second. And then the red output here is from Flyway. It executes the Flyway scripts. And then we have a jOOQ that is using this test container database, and finally generates the code, and we are done. So that's, in my opinion, the best way to generate jOOQ code, because it runs against the real database, and you have everything you need with this great plugin that was recently created. Now, finally, I want to say a word about jOOQ and JPA. The point is, both frameworks have kind of superpowers. So in jOOQ's world, I would say querying is perfect. I didn't show you a dynamic query, but you can use the DSL to create dynamic queries. You can use every step in the API. You can store it. You can reuse it. It's perfect if you, for example, create search forms. So it's very easy to create dynamic querying. Reading nested object, as I shown you with this multi-set operator, is a wonderful thing. And something that we didn't look at is calling functions store procedures. That's also the best way to do that, because jOOQ will generate a class for every store procedure or every function, and you can use this class to call that procedure or function, and it feels like you're using Java code. So there's more or less no difference in calling a method in a Java class than calling a store procedure in the database if you're using jOOQ. And bulk updates and deletes, but this could also be done with Hibernate. On the other hand, we have JPA or Hibernate, and there, if you really need that or you want that type of entity state transition where you have cascading, so if you have really model your entity structure or your entity graph and you want to have cascading or orphan removal or stuff like that, then Hibernate is great. Because with jOOQ, you have to delete each element, or if you want to have cascade delete, for example, you could define that via the foreign key constraint in the database, and then the database will take care of cascading. Exactly. And that's it. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Is there transaction support?
Very good questions. Is there transaction support? Yes, there is transaction support in multiple ways. First of all, and I didn't show you because we can't see it really in the example because I'm using Spring Boot. But here on the query test, we have this jOOQ test, and this annotation has annotations like transactional. And this transactional is the transaction manager of Spring Boot. And because transactional, a test with a transactional annotation means every test method will do a rollback at the end of the method. And yes, so you can take part, or jOOQ can take part of the transaction management of the framework. Or if you run it in an application server, you could use the JTA transaction manager from the application server. And jOOQ also has transaction support if you don't have anything like that. So you could call jOOQ transaction. And this one takes a lambda, and you can get the configuration. And there, the contract is if you throw a rollback, a runtime exception, it will do an implicit rollback. Otherwise, it will do a commit at the end of the lambda. Or you could even do that manually to get the connection from the configuration and start the transaction and end the transaction on the connection. So you have various ways. There is even something that is not available with Jakarta E or Spring or Quarkus. jOOQ supports nested transactions. So it save points and all the thing that the database supports. That's not available if you use standard JTA transactions. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes? Yeah, the question is if I could say something about performance. The point is the performance is as good as your SQL statement. I mean, you're building SQL, and this means usually you try to tune that, or you have execution plans, you look at that because you're on the SQL level, right? So you're creating or crafting select statements, and you will tune that until it works very well. Because you don't have problems like you get if you use mapping in Hibernate, because usually what I see with my clients is this n+1 select problem, you know. If you fetch like, what do we have here? For example, I fetch the categories, and then I navigate to the athletes of this category, and this will execute per athlete, for example, a SQL statement. And such things I will not have because I have to write my SQL as it is. Yes. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, but there's also the overhead of creating your object. Your objects are Java objects. Is that different from
It's a bit different because it depends. So if we look at plain JPA, if you query data or you query entities in a transaction, your entities will become managed. So these are managed objects, and Hibernate will take care about that, and there is some overhead about that, usually with Hibernate. But Hibernate also knows a stateless session, which avoids this kind of overhead. But creating the objects is more or less the same, so it has to instantiate the object, but jOOQ does nothing with the object. It just creates a new instance, fills the data inside, and that's everything. Hibernate may create a proxy, for example, for the entity object or something like that to do state tracking, and that will not happen with jOOQ. jOOQ is just executing SQL and filling the result in objects.
Mix it? You have parts in Hibernate.
You can mix it. We have 0 minutes left, but I think after my talk there is a break. Let's take this one. For example, here we have a JPA test. Here in that case, I use the entity manager to create a native query, but I create the native query with jOOQ. And then I can simply call getSQL that will return the SQL that I created with the Fluent API and say, JPA, hey, this is a native query, execute it and return entities, for example. Yeah. So in my opinion, this works very well, or we use that even because I often come a bit late to my customers. I usually come in when they already have performance issues. And then usually there is Hibernate and I help them to improve the performance, and they often I try to bring in jOOQ, and then we start with such things. So we create the queries not with Hibernate, we create it with that, and then we migrate reading fully to jOOQ and use Hibernate just for writing. So that could be an approach. So you use jOOQ and nested objects for reading. So if you have a REST API, reading will always be with jOOQ, and writing may be with Hibernate. So you get a DTO, for example, as on a post request, and you use that to populate the entity and store the entity at the end. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are Java enum types supported in jOOQ?
Are Java enum types supported? Yes, but maybe you will not use them, because if you're in the database, databases also support enums. So here, for example, I have a schema that has an enum. Let's see where it is. Here. That's an enum in the database. And that means I also get a class that is MPA rating. And as you can see, jOOQ will generate from the database enum a Java enum. So if you want to use enums with the database, you should create them in the database, because you can use it then as a constraint. You can do a check constraint in the database that only these values are allowed, and jOOQ will generate them that you can use it from the Java code. Because if you create it in Java and then use it with the database, then you would have to align both enums value if you want to use it on both sides. Yeah. Okay? Yeah.
In JPQL, you can't fetch two lists at the same time on the base entity. Otherwise, you will get a multiple backfetch exception.
Yep.
Can jOOQ do that?
Yes, because here we use multi-set or nested queries, and I can sort each part of the query, because it will use the JSON functionality if this is supported. The other one, by the way, that's just a limitation of Hibernate. Other OR mappers don't have this limitation. Yeah. It's a design decision of Hibernate. Okay? Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Last one.
Partitions in nested queries.
Yes, that should work as well. Yeah. Yeah, you can use everything from the database. You can use window function if you know what this is. You can use recursive queries. jOOQ even supports stuff like connect by. So Oracle has this connect by functionality that you can do hierarchical queries, and jOOQ will simulate that or emulate that on other database types if there's some support for doing that. Okay. Thank you very much.